Dr. NightEchoes. I was exploring an abandoned psychiatric ward in England. The building was a maze of long, sterile hallways and heavy steel doors. It looked like someone had used their teeth to rip the thick material off the stone. Behind the padding on the original wall, someone had painted a very detailed mural. I held my flashlight steady to see the artwork. It was a painting of the exact hallway I had just walked down to get to this room. Every detail was perfect. I could see the rusted gurney I had passed. I could see the specific pattern of the peeling paint on the ceiling. The mural showed the hallway from the perspective of someone standing inside the cell. But in the painting, there was a figure standing right behind the person looking in. It was a tall, faceless shape that reached from the floor to the ceiling. It was leaning over the shoulder of the person in the drawing. I realized the person in the mural was wearing the exact same jacket I had on. The painting was so fresh, I could still smell the wet pigments. I felt a sharp, cold draft hit the back of my neck. It felt like someone had just exhaled right against my skin. I turned around so fast I lost my balance and fell onto the concrete floor. My flashlight rolled away into the corner. In the brief moment the light swept across the doorway, I saw a pair of long, pale feet standing just outside the room. They were bone white and had no toes. I grabbed my light and scrambled out of the cell. I didn't look back. I ran through the maze of hallways until I burst through the main entrance into the rain. I didn't stop until I was inside my car with the doors locked. When I got home, I took off my jacket to throw it in the wash. I saw a smudge of black paint on the shoulder. It was the shape of a large, thin hand. I tried to scrub it off, but the paint wouldn't move. It felt like it was part of the fabric now. I can't stop thinking about that mural. I'm afraid that if I go back to look at it again, the figure in the painting will be even closer. I was exploring an old Victorian mansion that had been empty for 50 years. The house sat on a hill and looked like it was rotting from the inside out. Most of the rooms were stripped bare, but the master bedroom still had some heavy furniture covered in plastic. I walked over to a large walk-in closet and pulled the door open. Inside, there was a life-sized mannequin standing in the center of the small space. It was dressed in a suit that looked like it belonged to the original owner. I recognized the fabric from some old black and white photos I had seen downstairs. The mannequin was incredibly realistic, with glass eyes that seemed to catch the light from my flashlight. I reached out to move the mannequin so I could see behind it. When my hand touched its neck, I froze. The surface wasn't cold plastic or hard wood. It felt like soft, yielding skin. More than that, it was warm. It wasn't just warm from the room air. It had a steady internal heat that felt exactly like a living human body. I pressed my fingers against the throat, and I felt a faint, slow vibration. It wasn't a pulse, but a low hum like a machine or a hive of insects. The eyes of the mannequin shifted slightly toward me. I backed out of the closet and tripped over a loose floorboard. I didn't take my eyes off the open door. As I scrambled to my feet, the mannequin took a small, stiff step forward into the bedroom light. Its joints made a dry, cracking sound like breaking branches. I didn't wait to see it walk. I ran out of the room and down the stairs. I could hear the heavy, rhythmic thuds of it following me down the hallway. I burst through the front door and didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I got home, I took off my jacket and saw a faint red mark on my hand where I had touched its neck. It looked like a heat burn in the shape of a thumbprint. That house was demolished a month later. The crew reported finding the master bedroom closet empty, but they found a pile of shed human skin in the basement. I still feel a strange heat on my neck whenever I stand in a dark room. I went into an abandoned elementary school in Chicago on a Tuesday afternoon. The building was a hollow shell of red brick and broken glass. I made my way down to the basement levels, where I found a classroom at the end of a corridor that was different from the others. The door wouldn't budge when I pushed. I looked through the small glass pane and saw that every single desk in the room had been piled against the door from the inside. They were stacked high and tight like a barricade. I found a small transom window above the frame and squeezed my way through. I dropped onto the floor and the dust swirled up around my boots. The room was freezing. I turned my flashlight toward the back wall and stopped breathing. The entire surface was covered in black writing. Someone had used chunks of charcoal to scrawl the same sentence over and over from the ceiling to the floor. The teacher says we can't leave until the sun goes out. The handwriting was small and shaky, like a child's script. The letters were layered on top of each other until the wall was almost solid black. There was a single wooden chair in the middle of the room facing that wall. On the seat of the chair was a small pile of fingernails. They were jagged and dirty. I heard a soft scraping sound coming from the corner of the room. It sounded like a stone dragging against the floor. I moved my light and saw a small pile of charcoal pieces. One of the pieces was moving. It was being pushed by a hand that was reaching out from a gap in the floorboards. The hand was thin and pale, with no skin on the fingertips. It grabbed a piece of charcoal and started to write a new line at the very bottom of the wall. I didn't stay to see the rest. I scrambled back up the desks and out through the window. As I ran down the hallway, I heard a bell ring. It was the old school bell for dismissal, but the sun was still high in the sky. I haven't been able to sleep with the lights off since that day. I keep thinking about what happens to those kids when the sun finally sets. I was exploring a series of storm drains in Las Vegas. These tunnels go on for miles under the city. I was deep underground, far away from any entrance or light. I found a small alcove that had been carved into the dirt wall. It was set up like a shrine. There were hundreds of Polaroid photos taped to the walls. I held my light up to see them. They were all photos of people sleeping. None of the photos were taken in the tunnels. They were all taken inside bedrooms and private homes. Some of the people were in bunk beds. Some were on couches. They were all completely unaware that someone was standing over them with a camera. The photos were organized by date. I looked at the most recent one. It had been taken only 2 hours ago. It showed a man sleeping in a room that looked very familiar. I realized I was looking at my own bedroom. The photo showed me asleep in my bed. The angle was from the corner of my ceiling. I could see my phone charging on the nightstand. In the photo, there was a thin, pale hand resting on my pillow right next to my head. I realized that whatever was living in this drain had been in my house while I was unconscious. I heard a wet, sliding sound coming from the darkness further down the pipe. It sounded like something heavy being dragged through the mud. I didn't want to see what was making that noise. I turned and ran back toward the ladder. Every time my flashlight hit a turn in the tunnel, I expected to see a flash of a camera. I climbed out of the manhole and bolted for my car. I drove straight to a hotel and stayed there for 3 days. When I finally went home, I checked the corner of my ceiling. There were 4 small pinpricks in the drywall where a camera could have been mounted. I looked at my pillow and found a single, long fingernail tucked under the case. It was yellow and smelled like the sewer. I moved out of that apartment the next day. I still can't sleep unless I am facing the door. I always keep a light on. I am terrified that if I close my eyes, I will hear the soft click of a camera shutter in the dark. I was exploring an old ghost town in the Arizona desert. The sun was setting, and the heat was being replaced by a sharp, dry cold. I entered a small wooden house that was slowly melting into the sand. The floorboards groaned under my boots. The living room was empty, except for a thick layer of dust and an old rotary phone sitting on a built-in wall shelf. It was a heavy, black model from the 1950s. The cord was frayed and led into a hole in the rotted wood. There was no way a dial tone could exist in a place abandoned for 60 years. Suddenly, the phone started to ring. The sound was high and metallic. It echoed through the hollow house and made my teeth ache. I froze. My friend, who was with me, laughed nervously. He said it was probably some old wiring or a prank. He walked over and picked up the receiver before I could tell him to stop. He held it to his ear and his face went white. All the color drained out of his skin in a second. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for 10 seconds while his hands started to shake. Then he dropped the phone and bolted out the front door. I followed him to the car. He didn't speak the entire drive back to the hotel. He just stared out the window with his jaw clenched. Later that night, I finally got him to talk. He told me that when he picked up the phone, there was no static. There was only a clear, digital-sounding voice on the other end. The voice didn't say hello. It just started reciting his full social security number. Then it told him the exact time and date of his mother's death. His mother is still alive and healthy. The voice finished by saying a specific address in our hometown. It was the address of the house he had just moved into. Since that trip, my friend hasn't been the same. He sold his house and moved across the country, but he still gets calls on his cell phone from an unknown number. He never answers them. Last week, I looked at his phone while it was vibrating on the table. The caller ID was just a string of coordinates. When I looked them up, they pointed to the exact spot in the desert where that ghost town sits. I was exploring an abandoned tuberculosis hospital in Kentucky with 2 friends. We reached the surgical wing where, sitting right on the center of the table, was a modern, battery-operated baby monitor. It was clean and white. It looked like it had been taken out of the box that morning. We stood there for a long time. The only sound was the drip of water from a pipe somewhere behind us. My friend started to say something, but the monitor suddenly crackled to life with a sharp burst of static. It was loud enough to make my ears ring. Then the noise smoothed out into a soft, wet breathing sound. It sounded like someone was leaning their face right against the other unit. A woman's voice came through the speaker. She didn't scream or shout. She just whispered very clearly, "He is awake." The tone was flat. It sounded like she was standing in the room with us, but there was nowhere for her to hide. I looked at the water. I realized that if he was awake, he was probably close enough to hear our hearts beating. My legs felt like lead. We didn't wait to see who she was talking about. We turned and ran back through the hallway. My boots splashed loudly in the dark water. I didn't look back to see if the green light was still on. I didn't want to know if the breathing on the monitor had turned into a laugh. I got to my car and drove for 2 hours before I could stop shaking. When I got home, I realized my phone had been recording the whole time in my pocket. I deleted the file without listening to it. I'm still afraid that if I play it back, I'll hear that same dry breathing coming from my own bedroom. I was exploring a decommissioned lighthouse on the East Coast during a gray, foggy afternoon. I climbed the spiral staircase to the very top. When I reached the lantern room, I saw that the protective glass was all smashed out. Shards of glass covered the floor like ice. I looked down and saw a circle laid out on the concrete floor. It was made of dead seagulls. There were 12 of them. Each bird had its head tucked neatly under its wing. They looked like they were just sleeping, but they were cold and stiff. They had been placed there with great care. In the center of the bird circle was a small white pile. I knelt down to see what it was. My stomach turned when I realized I was looking at a pile of human teeth. I didn't want to touch them, but I couldn't look away. I used a small twig to move them around. I counted them one by one. There were exactly 32. It was a full set. None of them had any blood on the roots. They were clean and white, as if they had been professionally scrubbed. I realized that someone had spent a long time sitting in this room. They had arranged this display in total silence while the wind blew through the broken glass. I felt a sudden sharp pressure in the back of my own jaw. It was a dull ache that made my head throb. I looked around the small room. There was nowhere to hide, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I looked at the birds again. I noticed that their feathers were dry, even though it was misting outside. Someone had been here very recently to keep them clean. I stood up and backed away toward the stairs. As I descended, I heard a soft clicking sound coming from the lantern room above me. It sounded like someone was tapping two hard objects together. It sounded like teeth hitting teeth. I ran down the rest of the steps and didn't stop until I reached my car. When I got home and looked in the mirror, my gums were bleeding. I still haven't gone back to that part of the coast.